Hello, everybody, and welcome to Knowledge as We See It, the show where we explore what engagement means to us in the workplace. I'm your host, Daniel Nathan. In this episode, I'll be joined by Connie Melamed, founder of Mastering Instructional Design and a recognized learning experience designer. With her strong background in visual design and cognitive psychology, Connie is an expert on how visuals can be used to enhance learning. Connie, welcome to Knowledge as We See It. It's great to have you on.
Thanks for inviting me, Daniel. I'm happy to be here.
Connie, before we jump into our main topic, I'd like to ask you, what do you do as a learning experience designer and why do you do it?
I find it to be a very fulfilling career because we're able to help people learn, build skills. I recently pivoted. I do less design work and more community work. So I have a membership community where I teach instructional design. So I do a lot more leading, teaching, and working with people in the field who are trying to build their skills.
That's interesting. Tell me a little bit more about that membership community. How does that work?
The way it works is people can join for a set amount of time. Some people have stayed for 3 years. Some people stay only 3 months. And we have speakers, membership calls, an instructional design toolbox, and self-paced courses and live courses. So it's been a really other side of the career that's pretty fulfilling also, because there are a lot of people who want to break in or who just have gaps in their knowledge. And I learn a lot from them too. So it works both ways.
Well, fascinating. We'll be sure to leave a link to that community in the episode description. Nice. So Connie, tell us a little bit about your background, where you're from, what your journey looks like, and how you got to where you are today.
I've lived in a lot of different places in the U.S., Austin, Maryland, Philadelphia, other places in Pennsylvania, Tennessee. So I've moved around a bit, and I enjoy that. I went to graduate school in instructional design a million years ago, before it was even in the catalog, and I just absolutely fell in love with the field. So I've just been a bit obsessed with it over the years, and I don't know, that's just how I got where I am.
You said before that you really love to help people, which is why you do what you do, but what was it about instructional design that sort of made you so passionate? What grabbed your attention, so to speak?
Well, I love that that it uses the creative and analytical parts of your brain. So the creativity part, I had been an art education major, so I love the visual aspect of it. But I also like the analytics, the programming, the stopping and deconstructing content, and making sure that you're meeting learners' needs. So I just love the way it's so varied.
That's great. And I'm going to ask you a couple of questions here. And one thing I really want to know is, let's break it down to the basics. How can visuals, things such as diagrams, illustrations, photos, how can they really enhance learning in the workplace?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we should make sure we differentiate between any visual and a relevant visual. So that's one thing. Although, on the other hand, making something that's aesthetically pleasing is motivating, but it still should be relevant. But there's this theory called dual coding theory that I would say is pretty commonly accepted. And that theory states that people have 2 channels for processing information: a verbal channel, which is anything having to do with language, and a nonverbal channel, and pictures are included in that nonverbal channel. So if we give people 2 paths, 2 channels for processing information, there's just a higher likelihood that they will be able to retain it.
Can I ask you a question? There's a theory that I read some time ago regarding, and you may need to help me out here, regarding the 4 learning modes, right? So we're talking about visual, auditory, kinesthetic, or maybe there's 3. Those 3. Is that a philosophy that you buy into?
I wonder if that has something to do with learning styles, or I'm not familiar with that whole concept. Learning styles, as we discussed through emails, has been disproven in the sense that they have not found that using different learning styles for every single lesson improves the outcome. So the whole learning styles thing has been somewhat debunked in some ways. On the other hand, people do have their preferences. Yeah. But the thing is, it changes according to the content and the context. Listening to a podcast while you're walking is a completely different mode than sitting at the computer. I wonder if that's the kind of thing that you were talking about. I'm just not sure.
Could be. So one of the things we want to discuss today is the usage of video within learning programs, within learning tools. Mm-hmm. How can video really be used to help the brain retain more information over time?
I think video can help when you know the purpose. So if you want to tell a story, if you want to show a process, if you want to do some role modeling, then video might be appropriate. There are probably other times when video is not appropriate. And there are also some little tips or guidelines that can make it even better, which is to be sure that the learner has control. In many cases, not all, but in many cases, the research has shown that when a learner can control the pace of the video, that learning is improved. Although, like all research, it never shows up as 100%. So there are always different factors. I always say, you read the research, but then always test it out on your learners. And that way you can confirm whether it's true in your particular case. So let's just say you were teaching a course on management, how to be a better listener. Well, modeling that and having someone watch someone do it, video would be appropriate. Or if you have a very boring topic, but you really want to motivate people, then maybe video that tells a story can really improve learning. So there are certain times, many times, when video is most appropriate, and other times when it's not.
You use video yourself in your course design and the work that you do?
I absolutely do use video, yes.
In terms of design elements, so things like colors, what role can colors play in learning?
I should say very quickly, when we talk about colors, we should be aware of the accessibility element of colors, because so many people do have a color disability. Back to what color does. I don't think there's any aspect of visual design that is more powerful in terms of emotions and what they can evoke than color. So as far as design goes, we want to kind of choose colors that evoke the emotions that we want to evoke, to put it beautifully. No, just joking.
Connie, what do you mean by that, colors evoking emotion?
It's interesting. When I teach a visual design class, I will show gray, and I ask people in chat, how does this make you feel? And most people say blah, bored, sad. I think of gray as a wonderful neutral background, but that's fine. Then I will say, how does this blue or green make you feel? And people, 95% of people will agree it makes them calm. calm. And yellow and red and orange, the warm colors, make people feel alive, excited. Some people, when I say red, show a block of red, will say angry. But colors really do evoke emotion in humans. That's just the way our brains are built. So we want to use the right colors and the right color palette. For example, we don't want to, if we constantly were using these extremely bright colors in a learning experience, it would probably be too much and be too overwhelming for someone. On the other hand, when we want to highlight something, get people a little bit more motivated, we may try to use a blend of some pretty exciting colors with some more neutral ones.
Interesting. That's a really fascinating way of looking at it.
It is fascinating.
Yeah, and in terms of, as you say, I want to sort of expand on this a little bit. In terms of using color to evoke emotion, you mentioned gray is a color that's generally we are generalizing a bit here, but generally associated with calmness. So when might you want to use a gray? And what kind of like piece of learning content, for as an example, would you want to use maybe gray as that sort of primary color?
Well, what's actually gray is more what a lot of people associate with as being a little blah, boring, or sad. And it's the blues and the greens, which research has shown evoke calmness. The way I would use them, both blues and grays, is as a light background, a very neutral background, so that it doesn't pop out. Let's say in an e-learning course, it doesn't pop out at the learner. It's more likely to recede and just be calming, so that other things can be overlaid on it that will pop out a little bit more. I do tend to use blues and greens a lot because they're kind of medium, just like right in the middle there, you know.
And then besides colors, what other visuals are particularly effective in helping the brain to learn and process information?
I think one of the most fascinating pieces of research comes from the idea that realism tends to have too much complex information, so that photographs and 3D renderings may not be as helpful for learning as more abstracted visuals, such as simple drawings, simple illustrations, outlines of illustrations, icons, symbols, if everyone knows the symbol. So you can reduce realism by removing some of the texture, shadows, variations in color. And in many instances, again, not all, but in many instances, that will be better for learning because there's less information, so there's going to be less cognitive load.
Exactly, that's a good point. Yeah, with complicated or complex images, such as you say, 3D rendering. Yeah, I guess you're right. The brain has too much information to process in that space of time, and makes retaining of that information more difficult. And yeah, I think here at Powtoon we follow that same sort of train of thought where using and you mentioned abstract visuals are a much better way. Using abstract visuals are a much better way to help the brain retain information. Things such as like even like animation, like simple abstract animations,
Sure.
Are a great way to help. I think a great way to help retain information faster. Let's talk a little bit about the common mistakes that you see instructional designers making when creating visuals, particularly those maybe starting out. What kind of mistakes should they try to avoid making?
One common thing that I see is people trying to fill up all the space and almost being too clever, because what we see around us is graphic design. In graphic design, the purpose is to, sell products. It's often advertising and marketing. And that's a different thing that you're doing to the brain than when people are trying to learn. So actually giving a graphic room to breathe, keeping solid or very muted backgrounds, even if there's a pattern, really muting it. Those are the kinds of things that a new person may not want, because it seems like, well, I'm not doing a very good job. I have all this extra space here. I can put in a cute little piece of clip art and, a cartoon. It would look so much better. Or they're concerned that something's going to be too plain. But actually, plain is wonderful.
Connie, I think what we've seen in the last, I don't know, I would say 5 to 10 years is a huge advancement in technology and learning, okay, from things like LMS, LXP, people using AI and augmented reality in learning. In light of the advancement in technology, where do you think training will continue to evolve? Where do you think the use of visuals in learning and education will continue to evolve?
I think it's not only in the world of training and online learning, but it's everywhere. Over time, because of computers, our society has become much more visually oriented, so that obviously visuals will continue to be used, in particular data visualizations. That's one thing we hadn't discussed. Anytime people have a massive amount of data or a complex machine to understand, very abstract visuals like graphs, charts, diagrams, timelines really make things concrete. So I think we will continue to use those. And I think people will begin to get more sophisticated, realizing that visual language is an equivalent, but in a different way, to written language. I mean, ideally, the two things that work best together are visuals and words. I mean, there was some research that the Nielsen Norman group did that showed that icons work better when there's a little text with them too, because then someone doesn't have to wonder, what does the magnifying glass mean? Does it mean search or does it mean enlarge? So having a little bit of text, can really help. So words and images together are an excellent combo.
You mentioned actually a few moments ago data visualization, and I think this is something that a lot of content creators struggle with, how to represent and conceptualize data, perhaps often complex data, in a way that, as you've mentioned, doesn't overload the brain. Could you maybe share some best practices when it comes to data visualization? What should learning experience designers be looking to do when trying to create that content?
Well, often we're just using simple things like spreadsheets. There's an entire class of people who their full-time job is to do very serious data visualization with programming, and that's a whole other ballpark. But if we are simply creating graphs to show data, which really, really helps, I think making sure that you know which chart is going to be the best and easiest to read can really help. There's a full array of what is easiest for people to read and understand and interpret. Essentially, we're decoding these data visualizations. So, for example, bar charts that are either vertical or horizontal are very easy for people to read, because we have the experience in physical space that when something's taller, there's more of it. A stack of items. So therefore, a bar chart that shows height, a vertical bar chart, is going to be easy to read. People usually make their judgments through comparisons. So if you want people to compare something in a bar chart, then keep all the bars the same color. It's a whole science. There's a lot about it. I have some articles about it on my site, theelearningcoach.com. I think I have one or two articles with guidelines about making your information graphics easy to decode or easier to decode. But those are a few things that come to mind quickly.
You know what I find really interesting, and you've mentioned it a few times, you've alluded to it a few times in this podcast, is when it comes to creating learning content, you've said it a few times now, keep it simple. And I think that's often a point that is very overlooked. Whether you're a new learning experience designer, instructional designer starting out, or maybe you're seasoned veteran like yourself, perhaps people have a tendency to overcomplicate because they want their visuals to look bright and sparkly and dynamic and engaging, when in fact the point you make, which is very valid, is perfect with bar charts, right? Bar charts is a very simple, right, and years old, decades old visual way of visualizing, conceptualizing data. Yet it's so effective because, as you say, we associate the length or the height of something with more data, with a positive number, and I think that is a point that's often overlooked. And I didn't consider how important keeping it simple is when creating content. So that's I think that's a really good point. I think that's a point hopefully a lot of our viewers and listeners will take away from this.
I think we have to realize that it's kind of depressing. I mean, we all want to be, great at graphics, and I want to make things clever and really exciting and wild and crazy, but that's another field, unless, on occasion there might be a situation where you want to do something wild and crazy, but generally,
keep it simple.
If you're really into visual design, it's a little like, this is kind of a bummer, but that's the way it is,
But yeah, I mean, like you say, you can't challenge the science. The science is there that the brain the brain only has so long to take in so much information, and the more information you throw at it, such as complex, you mentioned it before, complex 3D rendered images, the more challenging it is for the brain to absorb that information. So no, you make a very good point indeed.
One other thing that we have to always keep in mind is that it's not about us; it's about them. So it's never about us. So even though we want to and have an urge to create something really clever, it's not going to be best for the learner. So that's why it's about them.
That's also an interesting point. I didn't think of this. So tell me then, Connie, considering the audience who are going to be consuming the content you're creating, do you have to adjust the type of content you're creating based on the demographic who are going to be viewing it, whether that be, for example, Gen Z, Millennials, Gen X? How does that come into play?
I definitely base it on audience research and who the audience is. I almost never base it on, I don't know if I've ever based it on generations. The research about generations just, the media likes to hype it up a lot.
Right.
But I'll never forget, several years ago, I was talking to a university professor, and she mentioned how it's, and I know this is true from the research, how, they will have many new students get very confused by having to take an online course. And that's because just because you're of a certain generation does not mean that you're computer literate. So people may be coming from a background where they didn't have a computer or where there wasn't a computer lab in the school. So they give the same instruction for how to take an online course and the same level of help to every single student. And that just had a big impact on me. We really can't make assumptions. You can have someone who's 80 years old be a computer whiz, and you can have someone who's 18 who's not very computer literate. But I will base it on demographics and job roles and where people are going to be doing the learning. So if someone is a truck driver, a podcast is going to be most appropriate. If someone is a nurse on a floor where the computer cannot have audio, obviously we're not going to use audio in it. So those are the kinds of things that I like to take into consideration. In addition, if something is for baristas, then it might be different than if something is for bankers. So I will try to get to know a few sample audience members and see which ways they lean in terms of personality and, without trying to make too many preconceived ideas, checking my biases and stereotypes at the door, and just try to see what do these people, need, what is appropriate for them.
So one of the final questions we like to ask Connie, and you have already given some golden nuggets of advice already. Know your audience, as you've just said. Keep it simple. If we can just put those to one side, and maybe I'll try and dig a little bit deeper. If you had to give maybe just one piece of advice to someone designing a video learning course, what would that one piece of advice be?
I would say it's to really know your purpose. Because when you know your purpose, you know what you need to focus on, you won't get hung up in a lot of side things. And just remember that people hate talking head videos, and I would not do those for a very long time, more than a few minutes.
Do people hate talking head videos?
In general, after a certain amount of time, according to Jonathan Halls, who is one of my video gurus, he said you just have to start adding that B-roll. And for people who aren't familiar with video, that's just images that are not, that are relevant, but not of the person talking. Yes, maybe if someone is amazingly fascinated, that can work. And I'm not talking about a podcast situation, because people will listen or watch those. But often in a corporate training situation, the president or vice president wants to get on there and talk for 15 minutes. And I have noticed that gets boring pretty quickly. So instead, while the person is talking, you can show pictures of, people working at the organization, of a factory, of how it's helped people, those kinds of things. to up the motivation.
Connie Melamed, thank you so much for coming onto our podcast, for sharing all your insights, as I said before, your golden nuggets of advice, which I think a lot of people, including myself, will go away and give it some thought and implement in their course building careers. You've certainly helped us understand how we can boost knowledge retention and engagement in the workplace. So Connie, thank you very much for your time.
And thanks for the great conversation.